So we are approaching a $500 billion accounting fraud lie. This is just flat out bold-faced lying in just 1 year. You know, every year at tax time, I ask my CPA a question that I first heard Mo Howard of the Three Stooges ask his accountant. I want to know about the outcome of my income and how come I don't get some. And I swear to God, I really do ask my CPA this question every year. Tax returns are so complex, it just makes it impossible for anybody to really understand them. But I want to show you this chart. This is the federal government's income. And I want to ask the same question. I want to know about the outcome of our national income and how come we don't get some. So this goes all the way back to 1901. I love charts with all this historical data in them. But what you see here is that it goes along pretty well, usually going up, a little dip here in 1983. But then these big dips after the NASDAQ crashed in 2000, and then another big dip after the global financial crisis of 2008. So the revenues go down. Then it goes up. So this is taxes and all other sources of income. So there's excise tax and there's import duties and so on. And in 2015, after 2015, it sort of leveled out. And you can see that even though this matches the stock market here, stock market went up, it crashed after 2000, and tax revenues went down, the economy went down, we had a recession. Then it goes up, and then the stock market crashes, the economy crashes, we have a recession, the global financial crisis of 2008, and then it starts going up again, and it's going, if you overlay the stock market on it, these are pretty much in sync, and then something happened in 2016, 17, 18, 19. It isn't rising at the same rate. It's going very slowly. And so let's take a look here at what's going on. So this is total government expenditures. Total government expenditures. This includes the states and cities. So I just wanted to show you this to show you the craziness that we're at. In the first quarter, Q2, the second quarter of 2020, if we had kept on spending at the same rate, it would have been just about $11 trillion of expenditures. This is, to me, this is insane, the government spending this much. So let's go to federal government because that's what I'm concerned with. So this is just the federal government, and what you see here is Q1 of 2020, we were spending it at 4.9 trillion annualized. Q2, 9.1, so more than double. And then, it came back down and it's gone back up. But you got to remember that this doesn't include all the big spending bills that they're passing right now. These huge spending packages that they're going to use to lift us out of the economic woes that we're in. Well, it didn't work during the Great Depression. They kept on doing deficit spending, and it just prolonged and prolonged the Great Depression. All of the government's and the Federal Reserve's great ideas turned out to be the things that really kept us in the Great Depression. It was World War II and all of the gold inflows that we had. Well, the combatants, before we got into the World War II, the combatants in Europe were in it for several years, and when they take all their young men off the farms and turn them into soldiers, they need to import all of their grains. We had huge exports in the years leading up to World War II. I'm sorry if I said World War I earlier. It happened in World War I also, but huge gold inflows during both wars, preceding and then during both wars, and that's really what made us an economic superpower. But if you take the expenditures and then the receipts, and here we're measuring in billions and here we're in millions, so I take the billions and divide it by the millions and then times 1,000, and it gives us basically a ratio chart. And so here you have, if it's at a ratio of 1, you're spending as much as you're making. The budget is balanced. If it's above 1, you're spending more than you're making. And what you see here is that, it peaked back in 83 at spending 1.4 times our income. And then it goes down, and you see 1999, it's in balance. In the year 2000, there's a supposed surplus. We're at 0.94, spending 94% of our income. In other words, there should be 6% left over to pay down the debt. Back up to a ratio of 1, and now we are spending 2 times our income. But wait, there's more. This ends in 2020. The fiscal year for 2020 ends September 30, 2020. And so if you include all this extra spending was for the pandemic. The pandemic, it hit in mid to late March. And so all of the spending started in April. So you're talking April, May, June, July, August, September. You're talking 6 months only. So this is half of a year's pandemic response, going to 2 times our income. And then if we go over to, I've inverted this chart by reversing the division here. Instead of expenditures divided by receipts, I'm dividing receipts by expenditures, divided by 1,000 to once again give us a ratio chart. When it's at 1, it's in balance. And you can see here that our income is only 50% of our expenditures. So our expenditures are double our income. Let's go to the federal surplus deficit. Now, the other one was a ratio. This one is measured in millions of dollars. And as we expand the currency supply, the wiggles in this get bigger and bigger and bigger because it's not a percentage of the economy or a percentage of our income. This is millions of dollars. And what you see here, there's this sag in the 80s and 90s, and then the NASDAQ boom, the stock market boom of the late 90s. And we see a surplus, 69 billion, 125 billion, 236 billion, 128 billion. And if you add that 1998 through 2001 surpluses, the fictitious supposed surpluses, you end up with $559.357 billion. And then what I do is I go to find out the real deficit, I go to the federal debt, total public debt. So it stands at $28.5 trillion. So that's how much we as a country owe somebody, right? That's what the Treasury issues bonds, and that's what gets us in debt. If you take that and you do the change from a year ago, this is quarterly data, and I'm showing you this just to show you that it shows only one quarter, the fourth quarter of 2020, with an actual surplus. The deficit is supposedly reduced in that quarter by 113 billion. And then the crisis of 2008, and then the current crisis. And in one quarter of 2020, the annualized rate was $5 trillion, basically. I'm sorry, first quarter of 2021. Now, I'm going to take this data and annualize it. So it's at the end of each fiscal year, and what you're seeing here is that there was no surplus in the year 2000. Our debt increased by $18 billion. So all of those 4 years where we fondly remember the Clinton surpluses, that didn't exist. It wasn't real. And then it goes up in the crisis of 2008, and now it's just going off the scales. Now, I'm going to take this and invert it so that it looks similar to the surplus deficit chart. And the way you do that is you take this chart minus this chart, which would give you a zero line, times 2, which gives you the exact same thing inverted. And so here we are with it inverted. You see the sag in the 80s and 90s, the peak in 2000 with the $18 billion deficit, not surplus, and then it goes down. And, we should be getting more and more tax revenues at this point, but we're not. You saw that leveled off even though they think the economy is booming. It's just the stock market. It's not the economy. And then it just falls off a cliff after the pandemic. But remember, this is 50% of, this is only 6 months from the beginning of the pandemic, all that extra spending. And so it's going to be far, far worse next year. And then we go back and we look at the chart that the federal government publishes when they tell you what the surplus or deficit was. It is a lie. So if you add up these years of 69, 125, and so on, I already said this, it's $559.357 billion. If you go back to this chart and add up the same years, the actual deficit adds up to $268.72 billion during the same years that they claim a $559.357 billion surplus, for a total accounting fraud. This is an accounting fraud of $828.077 billion during those years. People refer to the surpluses that we had back then. They were not surpluses. This was a deficit. It was an accounting fraud. But look at this. If you go to the deficit that it's claiming for the year 2020, the deficit, the real deficit, the change, we went $3.605 trillion deeper in debt in 2020. And I don't know about you, but when somebody says, well, I started the year this far in debt and I ended the year this far in debt, but I spent less than my income, so I actually had a surplus. That is a lie. They had to spend more than their income during those years where they were claiming a surplus. So this is at $3.6 trillion. But if you look at the federal surplus deficit that is published by the government each year, they say it was 3.129 for a total accounting fraud in just 1 year, the year 2020, of $476.34 billion in 1 year. So we are approaching a $500 billion accounting fraud lie. This is just flat out bold-faced lying in just 1 year. When they report this, they make it said, some people will say, oh, well, you're counting the off-budget items. Yes, I'm counting. They don't want to include the off-budget items. They want to say, well, we had this much income and we spent this much, but we're not going to count these items that we actually did spend stuff on, but we're not going. Well, why don't they just call everything off-budget items, and then we had a $3 trillion surplus this year? It's all fraudulent. You've got to really try and look through the veil of fog here. That when they quote a surplus or a deficit, always know it's a lie. Go and find out what the change in national debt was. I want to thank you very much for watching. We'll see you next time.